So we're going to begin our class talking about what is research. And for your quiz, you need to know that social science can be defined by the use of scientific methods to investigate individuals, societies, and social processes. That's what social science research is. We're studying how society works. And what are the power structures, what are the motivators, what are the barriers. So we're investigating individuals, societies, and social processes. I'm going to post some YouTube videos about how rules for rulers, tells you a little bit about the critical paradigm and how power can be used to control and how it motivates human behavior. I think that's kind of insightful. And when we talk about theory in the next PowerPoint, you'll see how that's a whole theoretical perspective of everything, every decision we make being related to power and oppression. There's other angles that we can study the world, but what's important is we think about how do social workers know what to do? How do we know what works and what doesn't work? Well, it's through testing things out, collecting data, and showing that certain interventions had an impact or the certain intervention did not have an impact. So it's through methods of data collection that we know what works in social work and how we develop our field further. We're going to think about how do we know things? How do we know what is true? There's a YouTube video I want you to see about what is real, and it describes some of the vocabulary about how we study reality and how we know what is real and what is not. And at the simplest level, we have our natural intuition of what we think sounds right and what sounds real, what seems to make sense. There's some truth in intuition sometimes, but it's not the strongest sense of understanding. There's direct experience. And certainly the more experience you have, the more you just know what's going to work and what's not going to work. As a parent of 14 years, I have some experience in parenting and knowing what works with my particular child. But as anyone knows, everyone is a little bit different. So direct experience may be limiting in terms of our understanding of things. There's practice wisdom developed over decades. So if you work with many different populations, you'll over time have this just sense of what works and what doesn't work, what's right, what's not right, based on your acquired wisdom over time. But at the highest level, we have scientific inquiry and research methods where it's been tested, it's been proven, it's been shown to work in larger populations and under very specific circumstances that can be replicated. So applying social science thinking to social work allows us to have more depth of understanding. Now, I'm going to share some links with you guys to show that our understanding of biases is always changing. There's a confirmation bias where we think what we think is right, we find evidence for that to be true, and the clearest evidence of that can be found in political ideology. So if you lean to the left in your political ideology, you'll see the things Republicans say and think, oh, everything they say is wrong or doesn't feel right to you. And the opposite is true as well. If you lean to the political right, people on the left, what the Democrats are saying may seem wrong and not right. And depending on your personal affiliation, you'll constantly find evidence that supports what you believe. And so confirmation bias is really real in political thinking, also in research. If you expect intervention to work, you will find proof that it works. And if you don't think intervention will work, you will find that it doesn't work. There's a next option here is selective observation, where we can limit the sample to people for whom the intervention works and ignore people for whom the intervention doesn't work. And this is often done from the perspective of who do we study in psychology research studies. The most commonly studied population is college freshmen, because college freshmen are cooperative and they're willing to do things for no money. And so a lot of our understanding of psychology is based on what college freshmen think, and those are not necessarily representative of everyone in the country. Overgeneralization, I tend to do this a lot, where you find circumstance to be true under one circumstance and you think it's true under all circumstances. And the Dunning-Kruger effect. This was a finding done in the 1990s whereby it seemed like the more you know about a subject, the less confidence you have about it. And the less you know about a subject, the more confident you are about your knowledge of this. I'm going to share an article with you that shows that it in fact isn't quite that simple, but there is something to be said of expert knowledge being more nuanced and understanding that things are not always true, like for example our understanding of vaccines and preventing disease. Vaccines do a good job of preventing some diseases, but they can't prevent all diseases under all circumstances. So whether a vaccine works or not, professionals in the field know that a working vaccine works much of the time, but not necessarily all the time, whereas someone who's less trained in this finds any evidence of a vaccine not working right, for them individually, will say, oh, vaccines don't work. So that's a common example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. When we think about biases, it's going to affect our observation of things like poverty. I'd like you to think for a moment, what is poverty? Poverty is a social construct. It's something that humans made up, and we define it by this arbitrary dollar amount that the government recalculates each year. It's based on a calculation in the 1960s when they were doing the war on poverty. They calculated what the cost of food was for an individual based on buying groceries for a week and based on just buying like simple raw ingredients. And say it costs $100 to feed someone in a week. Then they just said, well, multiply that by 4 because food should be a quarter of your overall expenses, and that is the poverty threshold. It's totally arbitrary to say that food is a quarter of your expenses, and it's totally arbitrary to pick a specific dollar amount of how much it costs to feed a person because there's variability by city, region, and type of diet and food availability. So something like poverty, this arbitrariness, and we'll talk about this when we get more into the measurement, but when we think about our perception of poverty, people in poverty, and the programs to address poverty, right now the government's creating all these work rules in order to qualify for the food stamps program, and the people that are creating these policies and these rules that you need to be looking for work are people that are themselves often millionaires and very wealthy members of Congress, whereas the people that are affected by the program may live a life very different than what the policymakers understand. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect plays some impact in how we design these programs, in the sense that the policymakers may not be aware of things they don't know and may overgeneralize. Certainly overgeneralize that people in poverty just aren't trying hard enough, right? It's an easy way to overgeneralize our perception of poverty. And selective observation comes to play. In the 1980s, there were lots of examples of something called a welfare queen, somebody that is living a good life on government money, and based on one news report of one person, but it was an exaggeration, and it was also an extreme case that isn't necessarily representative of all. So cognitive biases play a big impact on our understanding of the world. So we're learning about research methods today in general, and I just want to make sure you're aware of some of these basic words. It'd be helpful if you use these at some point in the class. Ontology is our understanding of what is real, and we use data collection to collect information about what is real and what is not. Epistemology is how we know what is real, and how we know it's real is based on convincing us that the evidence is supporting what we see to be true. That said, everything that's real is filtered through our eyes and our brains, something called our phaneron. You'll see in the video about what is real. And so what's real to me, what's real to you, might be a little bit different. And for people that are on drugs and hallucinating, if we study ontology in them, they're having a hard time figuring out what is real in the real world versus what's just in their mind. We're hoping in research to be objective and find universal, unbiased truths that are true for everyone. But the social world is by nature largely subjective, in the sense that what's true and what makes sense to you is based on the experiences that you have and kind of continuity with your past experiences. So if we want to understand the subjective world, we do it through words, through descriptions, through qualitative approaches, where we get a deeper understanding of what it is people are trying to say, and we interpret meaning through that. So that interpretation is qualitative methods. But we can never prove things with just qualitative methods. In a court, when the judge is trying to decide what is real, what is true, they tend to use words and testimony to get a sense of what might be real. But there's always some level of is trusting one person versus another. In an ideal world, we can have objective truth, where there is something that's known to be true. And in order to prove something known to be true, we have to use numbers, because numbers and math should be consistent. It should always work. And so you'll see later when we talk about measurement, how we tend to assign numerical values to things. We create scales that we can assign numbers to, because with statistics, we can test hypotheses and prove that it's mathematically consistent. And its mathematical consistency is what is objectively true and harder to deny. So when we think about subjective and objective truths, if we look at, for example, let's look at trans identity right now. What's subjectively true about it? I mean, we can study people's perspectives and their experiences and how society has changed as more people have been comfortable coming out as trans. As far as like what's objectively true, we could look at the numbers of people and how that's changing over time. When I used to teach about LGBT issues, we thought that around 4% of the population identifies LGBT. Now, as it's become more socially acceptable, that percentage has risen to as high as 8 to 10% of young people coming out as not completely straight on some level. So when we think about research methods, we can use these to explore social issues and problems in society that shape how our society is organized. And we can use the data collection to understand how we can evaluate the effectiveness of social work interventions. And we're going towards a world where everything is evidence-based. There's proof that something is true or not true. And so we're going to, there's a quiz question on here about, maybe it's not in this quiz, I think it's on the final exam, so I'll review that when we get there, that the Campbell Collaboration is an example of an organization that tests evidence-based programs and collects and makes that information available. So by using Campbell Collaboration approach, we have a process by which practitioners can examine the literature, the client, the self, and the context to inform interventions with clients and systems. It's ideally giving us instructions about what to do. That said, it isn't a guaranteed cookie-cutter approach that's going to work under all times, but it's a hint of what works. And when we're doing evidence-based practice, we're trying to take advantage of the best available evidence, understanding our clients' unique values and preferences and circumstances, and build on expertise. And research is an iterative process where we ask a question, we find evidence, we evaluate that, and then test it again. And so no evidence-based program is completely complete. It takes time. So you can click on these links yourself and see that you can search, I might as well do it, Cochrane. They often have a mix of medical and social interventions, so you can put any topic of interest, like depression, for example, and it's to talk about all of the evidence for all of the interventions related to depression. You see here, we can look at how depression is related to blood disorders, cancer, child health, complementary alternative medicine, consumer communication strategies, all kinds of different topics here. And if we scroll through the results, we can read about how certain drugs affect depression, how relaxation methods affect depression, how psychostimulants affect depression, and it goes on and on for dozens of pages. If I just click on this relaxation for depression as an example, it's going to review 15 trials and talk about what many studies have collectively found. And overall, they found relaxation techniques have the potential as a simple first-line psychological treatment for depression. Those who do not respond within a set time could be offered more complex psychological treatments, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. So, and then we could search up cognitive behavior therapy and see what evidence there is for that. So Cochrane is a medicine-oriented, but good for some social science as well. Description about what is known about a subject. Versus the Campbell collaboration, what they do is they put together data sets that have studied the same topic and then reanalyze the data to do a meta-analysis so we can understand from a larger perspective, more people, what aspects of intervention work or what details of people affect their response to certain interventions and such. Then we have the National Registry of Evidence-Based Practices from SAMHSA, talking about all the different evidence-based programs that have been studied and add to our understanding. SAMHSA also has like these 60-page reports that are kind of the best known evidence that support different interventions. So that's the general overview of what is research. But I want to make sure you're really well prepared for our quiz this week. And so we're going to go over the next two topics, which are theory and ethics. So we're going to think about theory and paradigm. I'm not sure if you've heard of paradigm before, but it's a really powerful way of seeing the world. When you have a specific paradigm, it changes and focuses how you think. So here on the screen we have 4 different types of paradigms, and in the center it describes a paradigm is a set of assumptions that help us understand and view the world. So it's kind of what you assume to be how things work. So according to positivism, there's an objective true reality, and we can use deductive logic, and for the quiz you need to make it very clear you understand the difference between deductive and inductive, and we'll get to this in a moment. But deductive logic, which is using math and hypotheses, where you believe something to be true and then you test whether or not that's true or not. We're using empiricism. Empiricism means data. If it's a data-driven decision, it's empirical. So, and value-free. So with positivism is this idea that there is something that's true and we can use data to discover and prove that it's true. The opposite of that, kitty corner to that, is postmodernism. And with postmodernism, there is no truth. Anything that explains how things work is an overgeneralization, according to postmodernism. So let's pick a topic. So let's say we're going to pick something along the lines of homelessness and an intervention that affects and gets people out of a homeless situation. A positivist would believe that we can collect enough information and discover interventions that are going to work for certain subsets of the population, and we can prevent all homelessness because we can figure out what are the drivers of it and what are the interventions that keep people off the streets and in a safer environment. So that's a positivist approach. A postmodern approach would say the situation is so complicated, it's different for everyone, and there is no way to address this. There is no single truth. Each of us is living in our own world, our own set of beliefs, and we're never going to fully understand the topic. The next paradigm on the right, social constructionism, is this belief that everything we see is because we believe it to be true. And social class, rich versus poor, it's a subjective concept that humans have created and we all believe it to be true, so that makes it true. There's what's important, what matters to us. In order to study that, we need to use inductive logic. Inductive means you observe first and then come to some explanation in your mind later. So with inductive thinking, you collect the data, you observe, and then analyze it and come up with your explanation. So that's social constructionism, the idea that everything is just the way it is in our own head, and so we're studying our perspective with social constructionism. And a lot of social work research is focused on social constructionist type of view. Another popular angle is this critical perspective, and the critical perspective is the focus on power, inequality, social change, and values. And this is the idea that behind most laws is an effort to maintain the current social structure, whereby we create tax systems that benefit certain groups that have already benefited and punish certain groups and make it harder for them to become wealthy. When it comes to voting laws, we make it easier for some places to vote and harder for others. So the idea that a lot of policies are designed to oppress certain groups, tend to be groups that are of a minority of the population, or people that have historically been oppressed, and a lot of policies are there to maintain that oppression. We could solve a lot of social issues, but for the fact that policymakers aren't driven by solving problems, but rather maintaining power. So the idea is we're trying to understand the world. We're trying to understand what is real, what is truth. But ideally, a positivist would say we can do so objectively. We can collect the information and come to this omnipotent understanding of things through data-driven science. But it's not perfect, right? We don't understand any social issue completely. Whenever we think we do, it turns out it's more complicated than what we once thought. We haven't solved a single social dilemma. We might temporarily reduce homelessness in some group of, we might temporarily reduce poverty, but we're not on a path to fully solve it, to change it, because the world is more complicated than just a positivist perspective. And of course, when we think about things like gender, race, and class, these can affect our perspective for even what is objectively true. And each of us having our own different experience. So is true objectively possible? Can we step outside the world to observe it? In the YouTube video where they talk about what is real, he ends by talking about his cat and his keyboard, and talking about how the cat likes to sit on his keyboard because it's obviously important. We spend a lot of time on it, but the cat has no understanding of what the keyboard is. And I think that's a good analogy of social science research. We live in a social world. We all know something about how society works. However, none of us fully understands it. And so we all come into it with our own bias and perspective. So even we're surrounded by it, maybe we can't fully comprehend it, because just like the cat and the keyboard, there are complexities and abstractions that are beyond our cognitive abilities. So there are perhaps many different truths, many different things, each of us having our own experiences. And perhaps any attempt to explain personal experiences is going to be an overgeneralization. It's going to be sweeping and incomplete. So when we think about an issue like addressing food insecurity in rural Appalachia, a positivist perspective would think about the number of people affected, the amount of food it would take to address that, or the policies that would change. And so we think about how we could quantify the inputs into a poverty-reducing program and what the results might be, but in something that can be quantified. Because only when we quantify things with numbers can we prove that an intervention is truly effective for large numbers of people. Government agencies love quantitative big numbers because it justifies dollar amounts. A social constructionist might talk to people, experience, collect stories, and examples of case studies about how things are affected. That's less convincing because it's only about certain examples, but it's more depth. It tells us more about how life is changed by a specific program. So in reality, the positivist perspective tries to describe everybody. The constructionist gives us a lot more depth about a few people. The critical perspective focuses about power and why the society is structured as it is, why the policy is as it is, and most food insecurity programs don't actually solve the hunger. They don't actually change the level of poverty, right? They only address the problem temporarily at a minimal level. And the critical perspective would focus on how the policy isn't enough to address the issue. And the postmodernists would say that all explanations are incomplete. It's all historical and unique for each person. Theory is an explanation for how things work, and theory and paradigm interact such that if you're taking the systems theory approach, your paradigm is all about how different parts of society work together, how government agencies and nonprofits and families work with institutions, work with informal groups and such. So you're focused on how an individual fits in the larger ecological framework. With conflict theory, we're focused on who wins and loses, and again, the power structure of society. With symbolic interactionist perspective, we're thinking about how meaning is created through our experiences and what's important to you, what's not important to you, depending on different experiences and traumas and challenges you may have faced. And then social exchange theory is focused on how behavior is influenced by costs and rewards. So you're driven to social work not by the big money you're going to be paid, but by the impact you're going to have on other people. So for your quiz, it's really important if you think about inductive and deductive. And the very first question on the quiz, in fact, is about deductive theory, and based on this idea that deductive theory, deductive perspectives on the bottom, is focused on already having an answer and then using math, numbers, to prove that that's true. And you decide whether it's true or false based on the math. So in this deductive model, you are able to test theory, but you're not able to create theory, theoretical explanations. So the first question is about, it says, deductive research involves deriving specific expectations from general theoretical premises, and that is true. Okay, so the first question, you are deriving specific expectations from general perspectives because you're able to test it. The inductive model, which is also on the test, is this idea that you gather information, look for patterns, and then develop an explanation about it. If we want to look at what drives people into social work, if we want to do it deductively, we do a survey where we give people different options, and you choose which one is true for you, right? So whether you were chosen social work because you want to help people, or because you've been affected by a trauma in your life, or you worry about addiction issues, come up with a long list, and we have 100 or 1,000 people take the survey. Boom, we can explain what drives people into social work. If we want to do this inductively, we just ask them, and we listen to the words that they say, and we transcribe all the words, and we look for patterns in the words, and we get a lot more depth into what are the drivers. But we won't know how many people that it's true for. So deductive is numbers, inductive is words. Okay, that is what you need to know for that subject. Finally, we have our ethics topic. And with ethics, oh my gosh, you're going to know so much about ethics when this is done. But ethics is important. You're going to need to do the 120-minute training and the syllabus, but you're also going to need to know a few things for your quiz here. So, human subjects, anytime we know who the person is, or we are doing an intervention of some sort, you're seeing them, you're interacting with them, it's human subjects research. That makes sense. We can study people in ways that is considered not human subject research. And with not human subject research, we're either using publicly available things like information from newspapers or television shows, or we're using existing data for whom we don't know who it was collected from, or there's no way you can link the information to any one individual. So if it's not linked to people in any way, or it's linked to people but it's publicly available, then it's considered not human subjects. And you'll see later when we screen for how to evaluate the ethics of it, it matters because we care about data collection. So human subjects, we care about the ethics. For non-human subject research, ethics is less of a concern because you're not changing the people, you're not having an impact on their life. So let's talk about some of the major challenges that have happened in ethics research. The Nuremberg trial, the Nuremberg Code of the 1940s. This is based on the Nazis and some crimes that were done. A lot of experiments on minorities of all sorts, Jews, gay people, twins. So people were studied without regard to their well-being. And so as a result of that, the Nazis were on trial. And they developed something called the Nuremberg Code, which is 10 ethical principles that basically say people should voluntarily participate in research, be able to exit a research study when they are not feeling comfortable. They should be informed about why the research is important. The research should have some benefit to society and other factors. You can just Google Nuremberg Code and see the list of 10 reasons. One of the so this was done in the result of the 1940s, but the U.S. government didn't do anything about ethics in research until the 1970s. In fact, 1979, the Belmont Report was released that said that universities and hospitals had to have a review board, an institutional review board. And for your quiz, you need to know it's institutional review board because there's a question that's going to try and trick you. They call it independent research board on the test, and that's not right. It's the institutional review board that can review studies and discover whether or not there are ethical concerns. But prior to that, things were done that are ethically not right. So there's a video, YouTube video I'm going to share with you about the Stanley Milgram experiments, and you're going to see how people thought that they were torturing someone, and they were traumatized by that experience of thinking that they're torturing someone. The video will show you exactly how it worked. Humphrey's Tea Room Trade Study. Humphrey was exploring people having oral sex in public restrooms, and he outed several gay men and followed them to their home by tracking down their license plates. And this was done in the 1960s when this was not frowned upon. He discovered some of the people engaging in oral sex in men's restrooms were married, and by talking to them in their homes, he could have ruined their lives. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment is on your test this week, and this was a U.S. government doing a study about what happens when you don't treat syphilis. At that time, it was already known what happens if you don't treat syphilis. You'll have massive physical decline and die, but they withheld treatment, and despite knowing that these people had syphilis, just observed them for 40 years. And on the test question, it's about, it suggests that the experiment ended when a cure for syphilis was discovered, and that is false. It didn't end when the cure was discovered, it continued. So Tuskegee experiment was unethical because they purposely withheld from a group of black men treatment that was available. So it's false that the experiment ended when syphilis was discovered. Remember that when you're taking the quiz. The Institutional Review Board is there. It's a group of 5 people, 4 of whom are usually professors, and 1 is a non-affiliated person who has no affiliation with the university to give an outside perspective. And it's their job to protect the rights of human subjects by reviewing how the data collection will happen, both the data how they find the people and what the intervention may be, and what kind of questions will be asked. And there's a requirement that there be diverse perspectives. So there needs to be a scientist, a non-scientist, a topic expert, a member of the community, and usually a lawyer who's going to review studies for whom there's a risk. Vulnerable populations are people like pregnant women, children under 18, and people with cognitive limitations, people that basically might not be able to consent because their motivations for participating may not be for just the purpose of the study, but might be different, or they're not able to consent. So you need to know that there's 3 different levels. Exempt, in a case where there's basically no risk. In an exempt review, you describe the study to the one person in the institutional review board, and they can determine that there is no risk, no identifiable information, so you can go ahead and do that data collection. In an expedited study, you have the full committee will review, but there's only minimal risk and minimal involvement, so we just get a couple of different perspectives to ensure that there's no serious risk. But anytime you're doing data collection for which there's potential for trauma or harm, it takes about a month or 2 for these 5 people to think about it in great depth and provide feedback on it. So informed consent needs to have the following features, and actually there's a test question on this, but it's a little bit tricky. But first, let's talk about what's on this slide. So informed consent, you cannot waive or appear to waive your legal rights. So the idea is you participate in a study, if you're harmed, you can sue the university, and the university will be liable because the institutional review board said it was safe. So we can't ask people when they participate in the study to waive their rights. They maintain the right to sue if they want to. Researchers must explain their mandatory reporting duties. So if someone's harmed, we have to call 911. We need to report any trauma that a person experiences back to the IRB and refer them for appropriate treatment. We need to explain participants can stop the process at any time. So you'll see in some of the unethical videos, people wanting to escape the experiment and not being allowed to. That's not allowed. They have to be told at the beginning of the study that you can stop at any time. If confidentiality is part of the study, we need to describe how their identities will be protected. Usually we say it's stored on a password-protected device or something like that, but we need to explain what measures are taken to keep them safe, keep the information secret. We share details on the purpose of the study, so we need to explain why we're doing this, and it's usually to understand a topic in some depth. We need to avoid dual roles in the sense that the decisions made on the design of the study are made by people in the IRB that have no benefit from that. And we follow procedures for vulnerable populations. So if we're collecting data on children, we have both parent and child assent. If we're studying prisoners, we have secondary review. In addition to the prisoner consenting, we need others to consent on their behalf. If we don't follow ethical principles, there can be consequences at the whole university level. In this example, a university got into trouble because they collected family medical history. The father was upset that they collected this medical history about him, and he didn't consent about that. And the university didn't respond in a way that showed any concern, and the university stopped all academic research for a number of months as a result. We cannot promise anonymity when we collect data because there's a chance that where you collected the data, and when we explain the study, we usually say where we got the data, would potentially identify some of the people or at least limit the range of people, but we can promise confidentiality. And with confidentiality, we keep secret the information to the extent possible. And but we don't necessarily make it anonymous. Now, there's a quiz question about this, and the question is about what is true regarding the protection of sensitive information. And you need to know that what is true this is important to write down, confidentiality means that the researcher will protect and not reveal the participant's identity. So confidentiality, we won't reveal their identity, while anonymity means that the researcher participant cannot be identified by anyone, including the researcher. Okay, so confidentiality, we protect their identity. Anonymity, even the researcher never knew who they were. So as you're reading through the responses, that's the correct answer. Confidentiality, we protect. Anonymity, we never knew them. There is one question about the informed consent that I mentioned earlier. I forgot to bring up at the time. And there's the different elements of the informed consent on this slide. And so it's a confusing question asking about what doesn't need to be on the informed consent. So everything you see on the screen right now is what does need to be on there. But what does not need to be on there is we don't need to provide a full literature review. The full literature review is part of the research paper, not part of the informed consent that they get at the start of the study. Okay. Getting back to the quiz question, when we talked about the different paradigms here, there's a lot of questions related to the different paradigms. There's a qualitative question at the end of the quiz asking you which paradigm situation is, and I think it will be clear if you understand the basic issues here. But bear in mind that anytime you're analyzing a situation and what's happening in great depth with words, we're using a social constructionist perspective, and it's often an inductive approach. So inductive explanation of a situation, and a lot of social work is inductive. And theory, of course, are explanations of what we think is true, right? And so we use theory to make sense of interrelated phenomena in the world. We use theory to predict behaviors and attitudes, to understand what might happen under certain conditions. We can use theory to connect the implications of findings, and we can use theory to identify what to look for in a study. And we use theory to test hypotheses, right? So the question about what is not true about theory, keep in mind that theory is used to test hypotheses, okay? So as you remember that theory is part of hypothesis testing, you'll understand what we're looking for when we're thinking about what's not true about theory. It's related to hypothesis testing, okay? There's a question about which philosophical belief believes that there is a reality that exists that's true. I think you can see in the top left, the positivist is the perspective that believes there is a true meaning here. There's a question about protecting research participants using different ethical guidelines, and what you need to know is that a major ethical principle, of course, is avoiding harm. And so avoiding harm is one of the major ethical principles. Maintaining confidentiality, another important principle, because we want to protect the participants and not have a negative consequence of being in the study. So avoiding harm, maintaining confidentiality, and of course obtaining consent. So when you have the appropriate consent, you know you're ethical. So remember, when we're thinking about how you protect, that's maintaining confidentiality, avoiding harm, and obtaining consent. And with that, I think you're ready for the quiz 1. So what we've discussed is enough to prepare you well for the quiz, and I look forward to hearing more feedback from you on the discussion board. Look forward to more exciting interactions. See ya.